Welcome to Undefined, the podcast about the space between evidence and expansion. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, nutrition coach, counselor in training, and someone who is endlessly curious about nuance. And today is all about my hot takes on Fit for TV, the Biggest Loser docuseries. I don't know if you guys have seen it. If you have, this will make a lot more sense. And if you have not, this will still make sense, but I would definitely recommend going to watch it. Of course, if this interests you. I'll be honest, I am not a fan of documentaries. Just in general, I'm someone who doesn't really like watching a lot of nonfiction. Like, I'd much prefer to read nonfiction and watch fiction. I know there's a lot of people who only like to read fiction. Not a fiction girly over here. Can't really get into it. Any story that I gravitate towards is like very real and very like depressing, to be honest, and super intense, and getting sucked into the like romance novels, all that's just not for me. But I love watching stuff like that. So to me, I'd rather visually see something that is, I guess, fake or acted instead of a representation of something that is real. And to be honest, the bias that is in documentaries is just so strong, particularly when it comes to anything health and fitness related. I'm usually so out. I'm not even going to waste my time watching this. But this was different because it wasn't necessarily just a critique on one type of diet or training program. It was more about like The Biggest Loser as a whole, what it represented. So I was interested because honestly, I watched this when I was younger. I cannot remember for the life of me like what seasons, how many I watched, because, well, one, if you listen to last episode's podcast, you know my memory a little spotty. But I just like, we were watching the show, and there's a lot of people on there that I'm like, these were obviously key people, but I'm not really like remembering them. Like, there's like a vague memory. And I mean, even some of the stuff like the food temptations and the like where they're walking around with like food in their mouth and stacking things up, or the physical challenges, like I don't remember that stuff at all. What I remember about it was that it was obviously very intense. There was a lot of training, there was a lot of screaming, there was a lot of quote unquote motivating. And to be honest, a lot of it did seem inspiring because you would hear about the people's stories, and, it felt like they were still trying to do a good job with that. And you were like really bought in and wanted these people to succeed on the show. So that was like my memory. Obviously, everything that I know now, which is kind of funny, full circle moment of I've spent so much of my life studying weight regain, weight cycling, metabolic adaptations, all of that. And I speak about this really at any chance that I get. If you're at a party with me, I'll probably bring up metabolic adaptation. Kind of kidding, kind of not. But it was interesting to see this be the docuseries, and to really at this stage of my life watch something and see clips of that show and be like, oh, wow. And whether this is right or wrong, I would truly like to believe that the producers had good intentions. Of course, they're TV producers. They don't need to care about someone's health because that is not their role. They are producing a show. But the way that there was two producers who they interviewed for this, I don't know if there was like more who declined or just weren't a part of it, but two of them were on there, and the guy said specifically the reason he had this idea for the show was he was at the gym and there was a flyer that someone had written, said something along the lines of like, I'm obese, I need help seeking a trainer. And that was his idea. And I truly do believe that their intentions were good in that aspect. But there was obviously a lot of things that were done poorly, especially as the show went on. Like, the first season was in 2004, so I would imagine they probably started filming that in 2003. We knew way less, like, as an industry, but after several seasons of this and hearing stories and seeing how people are responding, it's like, hey, I will give a pass up until a certain point, but then it's like, this should have been handled differently. So first, I do want to get into some of the like exciting aspects. Exciting. To hear the term metabolic adaptation on Netflix and hear them reference the Kevin Hall study honestly made my nerd self so happy. I was not expecting that. And I, of course, wanted them to dive more into that and what it represented and have some. It would have been so cool to me if somebody could have represented like the scientific community talking about that. But cool to me is obviously not what most people consider cool or entertaining. So I did want to touch a little bit on the paper, and I have it right here. I will link it down in the show notes as well because it is a free download. So for anyone who's interested in reading it, it's honestly a very simple study. I'm not going to go through everything, one, because that would be boring, but two, because it is a free open access article. So I'll kind of hit like the main points. So essentially what they did was they took, it was 16 to start, but 14 finished contestants, 6 male, 8 female, which is fantastic. We basically have a 50-50 split. That's great. And they looked at body comp with a DEXA, and then they did an RMR with indirect calorimetry, and that's pretty standard measurements for body comp and RMR. They did this at baseline. They did this at the end of the show, which was 30 weeks. I actually didn't know how long. I couldn't remember how long the show was. So 30 weeks. And then 6 years later. This is like a researcher's dream. Like to be able to study the same people for that long. And while it's only 3 time points, those are 3 really crucial time points. And it's really like amazing that they were able to get 14 of the 16 to come back. So that was pretty exciting on my end. So any time that somebody diets, they are going to see a drop in their RMR. Now that drop varies greatly from person to person. Part of that is genetic. Part of that is how much muscle mass they have, how much they're training, the type of diet they had, just their own personal response to it. But on average, if you're taking someone like, as an example, someone who's 300 pounds versus someone who is 150 pounds, you could expect pretty large changes. Now, if you're taking someone who's 300 pounds, who is sedentary and has very little muscle mass and has not trained for most of their life, versus someone who is 150 pounds, has a lot of muscle mass, has been an athlete their whole life, yes, that is going to be different. But if we're looking at things that are similar, like one person who's 300 pounds, another person who's 150 pounds, who has a similar composition, either direction, they're going to have generally different RMRs just because of the size. Now, of course, weight of the competitors on The Biggest Loser was pretty high to start, and they saw a very dramatic drop during the course of the competition. And that would be normal and expected to see a very large drop. But what this paper highlighted, which is what metabolic adaptations are all about, is that at the 6-year mark, they still saw a suppressed RMR, even though they had regained a substantial amount of the weight. So that is where this difference that we're seeing, sometimes in literature, which they actually do reference in the paper, this is known as adaptive thermogenesis. So you'll see it written differently depending on what researcher is talking about it, or they could really be used interchangeably. When I say metabolic adaptations, I'm also generally talking about some of the downstream effects with hormones. So here they're just talking about this. But when there's this discrepancy between what is predicted or expected and then what is the reality of what is being tested, that gap is known as the, again, metabolic adaptation. What we're seeing is this adaptive thermogenesis. So 6 years after the competition, their mean RMR was about 500 calories lower than expected. Now, that is not surprising during the fat loss phase, but the fact that it's persisted 6 years later when the majority of the participants have gained a lot of weight. But here's what's interesting. So a lot of times we see science communicated on social media, in podcasts, in short clips. And this is where when people talk about cherry picking data, it's not always cherry picking data, it's how it's represented. So one of the lines in here that I want to read, I think highlights this perfectly. All but one subject regained some of the weight lost during the competition, and 5 subjects were within 1% of their baseline weight or above. So out of the 14 people, we're talking about 6 people right now, 5 have regained all of the weight, if not more. 1 person has not regained a substantial amount of weight. You could highlight either of these and both would be correct. So I could say, oh my gosh, Biggest Loser study comes out. Yeah, 5 people regained all of the weight. Oh my gosh. Very different than saying, yeah, but actually 1 person kind of maintained the weight loss. So when we look at research, we're looking at the averages, we're looking at the mean, and that is how you have to report data. You can't just report all the different things. However, when you really dig into it, that's when you can see some of the most exciting stuff, which is why I love when papers are open access so you can read these kinds of things and not just see the abstract, which nothing wrong with that. There's still important information in there, but you can tease out more detail. Honestly, I feel like the conclusion paragraph here just nails it, because they do talk about in the discussion how, yes, a lot of people regained weight, but to be honest, most people regain weight after a diet. So for all intents and purposes, they were actually pretty successful. 57% of the participants maintained at least 10% weight loss, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in real weight loss, weight regain literature, that is actually a substantial number. So essentially what they were saying is that, yes, a lot of the participants did regain a substantial amount of their lost weight at the 6-year post mark, but overall they were quite successful in long-term weight loss compared to other lifestyle interventions at this point. This was published in, I believe, 2016. But the metabolic adaptations were there. They were persistent. And basically what that means, and I'll just read the last sentence, long-term weight loss requires vigilant combat against persistent metabolic adaptation that acts to proportionally counter ongoing efforts to reduce body weight. And this is what they talk about in the show, where they were saying like, oh gosh, did I ruin my metabolism? It's always going to be harder for me. And to be honest, it's not that the Biggest Loser itself ruined the metabolism. It's just that losing that much weight is likely going to do that. And given how much they were exercising, it actually was better than most just crash diets, or a lot of diets that they just use in the literature where they're totally sedentary and they're just dieting. And there's going to be a huge amount of fat-free mass loss there. But the rate that they were losing on the show was quite fast. Like the numbers on there, like 10 plus pounds a week is a substantial amount of weight, even though the contestants were heavier than the average person. That's still so much weight to lose week after week after week. And I always just think of a rubber band analogy. Like the harder you pull, the harder it's going to snap back. And extreme efforts and extreme fat loss are going to result in extreme results. And sometimes those are good in terms of like, hey, I was 400 pounds and now I'm 250. Like that is life-changing for someone's health, let alone other things for them, but just like their health. But that doesn't mean that there's not going to be these side effects. So I'm very big on personal choice, personal responsibility, ownership, all of that. But part of the problem with this show and just any kind of dramatic weight loss, whether it's challenges or programs or even now, like Ozempic, the promise of Ozempic and losing all of this weight really, really quickly. The problem is if people aren't informed enough to make that decision. If somebody knows all of the risks and they still say yes, then that's great. That's on them. They want to go do that. But if they don't know, that it's going to be still afterwards really, really challenging. And all of the things that they did there, while they're not going to be able to replicate those forever, they still need to do some of them. Like the aftercare portion was like horribly overlooked, which we will get to. But before I get to some of the not so great stuff, I do just want to touch on another good aspect. I did have a list that I was like, okay, I'm going to try to go down this list in my notes, so let's not go too far off. One thing that I talked about in the beginning is I don't love the bias in documentaries. That's just the reality of documentaries. I understand that. But I did feel like at least they showed a wide range of perspectives and clips. And you got to see some people's really bad experiences. And you also got to hear some people say, this changed my life in a positive way. And after I posted about this on Instagram, I had many people reach out and were like, when I was overweight and the show was on, like, this was actually really motivating and inspiring for me. So it wasn't terrible for everyone. And it really just highlighted, like, you can have one situation and there can be 15 different perspectives, you know, like that saying, like, there's your side, there's my side, and there's the truth, or whatever, something like that. It's like that example that somebody's always the villain, somebody is going to be the hero, and then there's going to be some people who are kind of neutral about it. And we saw all those perspectives, which I really did appreciate. So, all right, let's get to some of the not so great stuff. What is good for TV is not always good for health. That's just that. Like, there is no way around that. And the literature has pretty much shown us, not just this paper, but ample evidence has shown us for years and years and years and years that weight cycling is one of the worst things that you can do to your body. Basically, once the fat cells are there, they are going to remember and they want to push you back up to that weight. And the more that someone diets and loses not only body fat, but also muscle mass, and then they regain weight, because your body's propensity is always to regain weight afterwards. And the first thing it's going to do is not regain a bunch of muscle. You're not just going to slap on muscle after you start eating. It's going to gain body fat. So what happens for most people is, let's just say they were 200 pounds, then they were 160. All right, well, now they get back up to 180 pretty quickly. That 20 pounds, some of it was water, maybe a little of it was lean tissue, but a lot of it was fat mass. So now they're heavier again, but they actually may or may not even have more body fat. And so this is what ends up happening where people start cycling. Oh my gosh, I'm at this place again, and I don't like how I look. Now I'm going to diet again. What's going to happen? I'm going to lose more lean tissue. So we know all of that now, and just the speed. And even though 30 weeks, like, when you really look at that, like, 30 weeks is a long time, and that's the amount of time most people were on the show. Of course, some people got eliminated earlier on, and I really don't remember how that works. Like, is that someone every week? I'm like, is this like Survivor? I really couldn't remember, but I saw some people, you know, of course, getting voted out and things like that. But, you know, that is a substantial amount of time, but it's just not enough time to really do this right, and to, you know, really make sure that someone's, you know, physical health is intact, but also let's bring up the mental health side of it. Whew. So again, I will give a pass early on. Not saying psychology has been around since the 1800s, so it's not like nobody knew about psychology, but our understanding, especially of physical and mental health and, you know, emotional eating and just, you know, trauma and how all this affects things was vastly different at the time the show started. But this is one of those things where a couple seasons have come and gone. You're seeing trends, you're seeing patterns. Okay, people are opening up about these issues, and most people fall into similar buckets of things. Like, every client is going to fall into similar buckets. Everybody has a unique twist on their story, but most people are going to deal with certain problems and certain issues. And you can start to see that unfold if you're actually paying attention. And what they could have very easily done is said, let's bring someone in who is actually trained in this. I don't care if it was a psychiatrist, psychologist, therapist, social worker, whoever it was. Why don't we bring someone in who is skilled in this area? Because we're opening the door to something very, very deep, very troublesome for a lot of these contestants. And we're not closing it. We're just leaving it wide open. And now the hinges are getting blown off and someone is trying to deal with the very real aspect of everything that's going on with the show, as well as, of course, all of the other things that they're dealing with and what that is bringing up. So one of the individuals on the show, she did a great job of pretty much sharing that. Like, this is why the way I was being treated here is why I would eat at home. And nobody was really listening. Now, I didn't go and watch the show. Did she share those things? I don't know. But I'm sure there were plenty of opportunities. And that is where specifically it was an incident with this contestant and Bob. And they're watching it back. And he could have so easily just been like, oh my gosh. Like, he did say this was not my proudest moment. But then he kind of just like smirked and didn't really give a shit. And that would have been a perfect time to be like, wow, what was I thinking? Here's what my intention was, but I should have done this, this, and this, and just nothing, like zero remorse for that. So that was a little strange. And I really just feel like bringing anyone on, like the show had ample money. And I understand that, you know, there was a comment about aftercare by one of the contestants, and I keep referencing this, but I will get to it. And the producer said something along the lines of like, well, it's not like we're making all the money, it's the network or something like that. And it's like, yeah, no shit, but the network has plenty of money to supply for this. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to have, you know, a world-renowned therapist for the next 3 years, but like, I mean, something, like bring somebody on the team. Hello. That was just like something that felt so obvious to me now. And I try to take myself back 20 plus years ago, what this would have been like. But after several seasons and just having enough conversations, whether it was the trainers or the doctor, just to say like, hey, I feel like we should talk about this, even if they didn't bring it on air. But to be honest, I feel like it would have been great to bring that on air. I feel like people actually would have been interested in that. So definitely some troubling things on the show. Of course, the fast weight loss, the dramatic changes, like, yes, that was a part of it. But really the lack of support psychologically and emotionally, I feel like was really damaging to a lot of people. And then truly this aspect of what is next, which is one of the most challenging pieces. So the reason I talk about weight regain so much is because while it is a very real reality, we have tools to make this transition better. We have tools to make this easier. And what happened was they put the contestants in this like tank of, you're going to live on the ranch, you're going to train 6 to 8 hours a day, you're not going to have any responsibilities, you're going to have all the food in the house. And outside of these temptation challenges, there's no real temptation, there's no real life. And of course, that's not going to be on the show, because that's kind of the whole point, is to isolate people and do this. But what are we doing after? Like, that was the fact that wasn't a thing, again, after a couple of seasons, just blows my mind. Hey, here's what is going to be recommended for you afterwards. The show is now over. You're no longer on TV. You no longer have the carrot in front of you. What is next? How can you reintegrate into society and life and your responsibilities and your job? Like, how do we navigate these things? Because nobody is going to be able to train 6 to 8 hours a day. Nobody is going to be able to live in this bubble and this vacuum. We have to figure out these real skills. So in my mind, some kind of aftercare program and would be absolutely necessary. Again, take away putting this on the show, which I still think would be interesting, but take that away. Like, there is enough resources and funds to they could have hired 2 people to help with this. Like, it's not like they needed to have this exorbitant budget. And it was just that seemed like such a disservice to people, because it's not usually ever the weight loss. Yes, weight loss is hard. Not going to sugarcoat it and say that it's easy, but you know what is way fucking harder is after you diet, for all of these reasons, for all the metabolic and hormonal adaptations that have happened, and also this just like come down of the goal being gone. And especially most people are just like trying to diet to like look better or feel better or move better or improve some kind of health marker. These individuals were on national, like NBC, millions of people were watching. Of course they were going to be motivated to stick through this. And think of how hard that would be to be being watched by millions of people every single week. And then that is gone. The show is gone. The reward is gone. The excitement is gone. And now you're back home with the same people, the same problems, the same kitchen cabinet, all the same shit. You gotta drive by. Like the one guy did his tape and he was in the parking lot and he gets donuts a couple times a week. He's gotta drive by that place. It's still there. So now what? So to me, that is really what needs to be done. And that is why I try to push so much for habit building and skill building throughout all processes with my clients. And it seems like boring and silly, but when we do an untracked meal and someone is learning how to do that, it's not just about that meal. It's about the bigger picture. It's about where are you going to be in 5 years? That's what I'm thinking about with people. And to just throw individuals back into their environments with really no knowledge, because there was no knowledge. There was some knowledge like through osmosis, I guess, in this process. Like, all right, well, when I eat like this is what happens. When I train like this is what happens. But it wasn't like what can I really do or directly, knowledge, especially in a day-to-day life. So that part was really mind-blowing to me. And really, honestly, this show was such a physical representation in my mind of like extrinsic motivation, especially to get started. Like they would show the tapes and like people are, thousands of people are coming to this audition, thousands at one location coming to this. That is how badly people want to change. And honestly, I feel like the numbers would probably still be there today. Even with this, I feel like it would still, maybe a little bit less, but it would still be there because people really, really do want to change. They do. But it's about how can we now develop the intrinsic motivation and the skills to continue this? Because once the cameras stop rolling and once this prize is off the line and once people aren't in my face yelling, now what? And it was just so interesting to see that. And I was like, wow, like this is literally that like played out. You always read intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation and what that looks like and what that's represented. But to just see it like that, I was like, wow, there really is like, it just shows the power of it. And I'm all about leveraging extrinsic motivation. I know there's a lot of people who say that intrinsic is superior and you should only lean on that. But I'm a realist. Like everybody has extrinsic reasons for wanting to do things. Like it's just the way that we're wired. And I don't think we should demonize that. I think we should leverage it appropriately and then build the other systems in place. It was so interesting too. I'm just remembering this, like the whole hang up on caffeine pills. And I was like, of all the things to be hung up on right now about this show, this hardly seems like it scratches the surface. Now, I remember Dr. Huizinga saying that he banned caffeine because people were relying on it. First of all, I was like, I don't know how anybody is here doing the show without caffeine. Like, honestly, props to everybody for being on The Biggest Loser and training that much and eating that little and having minimal caffeine. Like that was mind blowing to me. I had no idea that was that much of an issue. Now, in the like lawsuits or some of the papers that they posted up there was like a flash of it and it said like ephedra. So yeah, if they're making participants take ephedra, that's different. But the hang up on the caffeine pills was just this very just interesting thing, because truthfully, a couple 100 milligrams of caffeine is barely going to have any negative consequences. Now, I'm sure they were worried and just trying to cover their ass for, any kind of heart attacks and things like that. But I would be more worried with the pushing of exercise for 6 to 8 hours and not fueling properly over that. So it was just I thought that was a very strange part of the documentary, but I guess because there was lawsuits around it, they probably had to bring that up. And finally, I wanted to touch on something that I feel like gets misrepresented sometimes in the community and in the fitness community. And, this idea that like diet is most important. And there's even a part where Bob says that, where he says, we all know diet's most important, but that doesn't make for good TV. So we need to do crazy training. And I would agree that diet is probably the biggest mover, and it's the biggest lever that I'm going to pull, generally speaking. But if somebody is sedentary and they are not training and they are just cutting their food back, I really don't see the same type of look. And especially when we're talking about dramatic changes like this, the participants would not have seen the weight loss that they did had they not trained. So when we're talking about, this is where it's important to be specific with what you're talking about and who you're talking about. If you're working with someone who has 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds to lose, diet's probably the biggest lever, and we got to make sure that someone is moving adequately and training a couple times a day, for sure. But when we're talking about these extreme 100, 200, pound weight drops with some of these contestants, like there was not going to be a way that they would have been able to do that without exercise. So you can't, like that concept of like, you can't out eat a poor, no, you can't out train, you can't out train a poor diet is definitely true. If you are training, but that's again, when most people think of that, that's like they're equating that to someone who is training like 45 minutes or an hour a day, and then they're over consuming calories. That's very different than what was going on here. And I would say that in general, when individuals are more active, everything just works a lot better. Of course, there's going to be insulin sensitivity reasons for that, but also just, muscle and how your body just utilizes the calories. So they definitely didn't need to train 6 to 8 hours a day, obviously, to see those benefits. But taking individuals who are very, very sedentary and actually putting them through, training, it was a good protective mechanism versus just dieting them. That would have been really not great. Now, I do understand this was taken to the extreme, and individuals were going and saying, I'm going to do another hour or two of cardio on top of everything else we're doing. So of course that's where like the game part kind of kicks in for people, and they're like, this is a game, I need to play to win. And that is where you should say, well, should we be gamifying things like this? And that gets all complicated, and again, going to that kind of more extrinsic motivation. But yeah, it was a very interesting documentary. And I'll go back to my first point to still say that I was just really happy that they used the term metabolic adaptation on Netflix. And I do feel like they did show a lot of perspectives, but ultimately there were so many things that could have been done several seasons in that would have ultimately helped everybody on the show. Because yes, there were people who had some great results, and some people who still to this day are like, that was one of the best things that ever happened to me. But even those individuals still could have benefited with more education, more of an aftercare program, transitioning out of this effectively, and also actually working with someone who is a skilled mental health professional in some capacity, because everybody on that show was dealing with things and they were uncovering those problems in real time. And like I said, opening that door, and it was just, the hinges were blowing off and nobody was closing it or knew how to. So those are my hot takes, my reaction video. I feel like reaction is such like a negative connotation. So my hot takes, we're going with that. let me know in the comments what you guys thought if you watched this. And I will also, like I mentioned, drop the link to the paper. It is full open access. There's a ton of citations as well. If you guys, that's like one of my favorite things about research articles, is that if you get a good paper and you're reading something that you like that they cited, a good paper, you can come away with 5 other citations. So that's my favorite nerd fun fact. And if you guys have any other topics or suggestions or specific just scenarios that you want answered on the show, please, I would love to do that. That is one thing I want to make with this show, is to make it more of a community and really make it as interactive as possible. So drop those in the link in the show notes, completely anonymous. And until next time, I'll talk to you guys later.